we're one panelist short of a full panel, so bear me. There we go. Hey, Martin, how are you? So thanks, everybody. This is part 2. We're going to do a panel conversation. I'm not going to read our panelist bios. You have them in your packages, and they've already been introduced by Treasurer Frericks. But I would note that, so at Aspen, you know, we're one of those vague Washington organizations that has a name, and people say, well, what do you do? Well, what we do is foster dialogue about public policy. And there's sort of 2 key pieces of an Aspen dialogue that we're going to play out for you right now. The first one is we bring distinct voices to the table. So when you think about a challenge as big as making something like the Secure Choice program happen, we have voices from academia, experts like David, who's been thinking and writing about retirement security for many, many years. In particular, David's recently written a paper about a federal model based on the Thrift Savings Program. And for those of you non-retirement geeks in the room, the Thrift Savings Plan is the retirement plan for federal employees. So basically the gold standard of defined contribution retirement plans. Low cost, simple, one of the most effective retirement savings programs, if not the most effective retirement savings program in the country, and a great model for the kind of things that you're trying to do here in Illinois. Martin Novin from TIA, who brings not only his previous experience in the Treasurer's Office of the state of Illinois, but who speaks from the perspective of a retirement services firm that's been around for many, many, many years, that knows a great deal about how one offers plans to people in the most effective way possible. I think one of the things that we saw at the end of the conversation is that the plumbing, the nuts and bolts of getting this program right are going to be essential. And while it's incredibly important to focus on things like the default, investment rate, and automatic enrollment, it's going to be equally important if this program gets off the ground to make sure that the plumbing works. And the plumbing is all about getting the money from your paycheck to the firm that's going to manage your funds, and that's where Pete and the work of ADP and other payroll providers. So we think that perspective is incredibly important as part of this conversation. And then Lucy Mullaney, who's currently in the audience, will be joining the panel. She's the last speaker. Several people have noted already how in passing Secure Choice in Illinois, there are a number of organizations and people in this room who made that bill move forward. Lucy was one of those people. The Heartland Alliance was a key part of that movement. And as we move forward on this, I think it's really important to remind us all why we're here, who we're talking about, who are the people in Illinois who are going to benefit from these programs. And so we crafted a dialogue to bring those perspectives. There are many other perspectives in the room that are equally important, and that's the second part of this dialogue, which is rather than a panel where I serve as a traditional moderator, we're going to have the speakers present. We're going to open up a sort of 2 question and answer periods. The first one is an opportunity for the board members to ask direct questions to the panelists, and then after 15 minutes or so, we'll open up the room so other people ask questions. So if you would wait, for the folks in the audience, if you would wait until we've done that first part of the Q&A, that would be great. I would also say it'd be very easy to start asking questions after the first panelists speak. That's a great way to make sure that we don't get through all 4 speakers. So if you would, if you have a burning question, I'm speaking to the board members now, please feel free to ask it, but I think we'd like to go through all 4 presentations before we get to Q&A. So without further ado, David Madland, thank you.
Thank you all for your time. Let's see, I will start. Oh, good. We're already loaded up. Perfect. As Jeremy mentioned, my role, I think, is to explain a little bit about how the federal thrift savings plan works and why it could be a model for you all to consider. So let's first just, yep, there we go. Walk through a little bit of the overview of what this is. You know, as Jeremy mentioned, it's a basic defined contribution plan. It's large. It's the biggest in the entire country, and it's only been operating maybe about 25 years. They have in-house staff that manage a lot of functions, but they also contract out a fair amount of functions as well, including the investment management. So it's similar kinds of likely model to you all. This is going to highlight sort of the features of the Thrift Savings Plan that I think are important, and many of them you are already going in the direction. In fact, the principles that the board passed really point towards something like the Thrift Savings Plan. But of the Thrift Savings Plan things to feature, and the rest of the slides really are going to get a little bit more into detail about why each of these elements matter. So let me just walk through low fees, diversified, simple investment options, sensible defaults, and some payout phase options. Now I know that's not where you are with the current plan, but and you have time to do this, but I at least think it's worth starting to have this in the back of your head, that one of the questions you'll have to deal with is sort of what do you do once people accumulate money. Let me walk through in more detail. So there's low fees. Now the Thrift Savings Plan fees are incredibly low. This, if you are familiar, so 3 basis points or 0.03%, this is much, much lower than any plan in existence now, and it's far lower than what the Illinois plan could get to, at least in the short term. But it achieves, you should know the Thrift Savings Plan started off, when it started off, it had fees of around 30 basis points, about 10 times higher than this. Started off, so the real key here is that the direction, it started off at low cost, and it continued to reduce costs as it got bigger and sort of improved its operations. The reason the Thrift Savings Plan is able to have such low fees is, it's largely based on index funds. It has very simple, only a few investment options, and these huge, huge economies of scale. You can't replicate exactly these things, but you can get reasonably close. So why do fees matter? And I can tell from the questions in this audience, most people are pretty sophisticated in their understandings of things, but I think it's really pretty important to people understand that getting to as low of a cost as you possibly can really impacts the retirement savings that people will accumulate, and it makes a big, big difference. So these fees here, what you can see is over a person's lifetime, starting at age 25 and then retiring at age 67, how much fees will cost someone over their lifetime of savings. So 0.25%, that's relatively low, about as low as you could probably get in the Illinois plan. 1%, that's a typical 401k. 1.3 is probably a typical small business plan. So just here, going from a typical plan to a low-cost plan, it's going to save someone over their lifetime $100,000. Big money, really big money, even from relatively modest contributions, because what's really going on here is that compounding is not able to do as much when you've got fees taking out. So what fees do is each year, so imagine you're invested in the market, and each year you're getting around 7%, we'll just say. Well, there's inflation, so you're down to 5%. Now your fees knock you down to 4%, or you could be still up close to 5%, but 1 year, that's not the biggest deal, but over a lifetime, each year you're sort of taking this incredible power of compounding, and you're either putting it to work for you, or you're putting it to work for someone else in their yacht that they're buying with your money. So you really want to get fees low. Now, fees, you might say you're just getting a cheap plan, but actually the kinds of investments you get with cheap plans with low cost are as good or most likely even better. The performance, you're not sacrificing performance for low cost. And I will talk a little bit more about why this is, but I just want to highlight, costs are not a sign of quality. In fact, the opposite is almost true. Here's a quote from the director of research for Morningstar, Russ Kinnell. If there's anything in the whole world of mutual funds you can take to the bank, it's that expense ratios help you make better decisions. In every single time period and data point tested, low-cost funds beat high-cost funds. So you're getting better performance with lower costs too. So get the fees low. Here's one more slide to sort of, another way of thinking about this $100,000 difference is you're going to make someone work 3 extra years to get to that same account balance. 3 years of their life just because the plan design isn't right. So that really, really matters in someone's life. I certainly would be rather that person sitting on the beach with a little than the person working extra years. So get the fees. Now these simple, diversified, and transparent investment options. TSP really quite simple. It's only 5 funds. And then 5 life cycle funds, or maybe your nomenclature, you guys are talking about target date funds. Same basic concept. Let's look a little bit why. I'm going to go into more each one of these things and why they matter, and also, of course, index funds. But so here's what typical participants in a typical plan face. This is the number of choices of funds that they have. Median, that means half more, half less. 26 investment options, and that's way, Professor Thaler didn't get into this, but that's part of this sort of behavioral economics. If you give people too many choices, they don't make choices, or they make worse choices. You want to give them a relatively simple set of choices. It makes them more likely to make good choices. And it's not, you also, having more choices, the reason you have some range of choices is to get people a diversified portfolio so that you can have the right level of risk and return for people in their age and risk profile. But adding more funds doesn't necessarily get you that. In fact, it oftentimes, the studies here show most of the times when they have these many funds, a lot of the funds they add are something you would not put in a typical plan. So you can get diversified with a really quite little minimal plan. So let's look exactly at what the Thrift Savings Plan has. As I said, 5 funds. It's got a Treasury, U.S. Treasury, so very, very secure, lowest risk, and then kind of an increasing risk but in greater returns. Broader BOD fund, a large capital index fund, small cap, and international. Then all of its life cycle funds or target date funds are just repackaging of those underlying funds. The other thing to notice is, so the defaults you'll have, hopefully most people will be defaulted into the life cycle fund, but if people make an active choice, and the kind of active choice sometimes people make is just this sort of what's called naive diversification. They'll say, I'll just take one of each. These actually make someone give a pretty reasonable portfolio. It's 60% bonds, 60% stocks and 40% bonds if you just split up your portfolio in each of those funds. And so that's a pretty reasonable place to be invested. So you kind of are nudging them, even if they're choosing to do something on their own, they're most likely going to end up in a pretty decent place as well. The last and probably most important thing to highlight about all of these funds is their index funds. That means they are just designed to track the market. They're not trying to beat the market. It might think, an active fund will do really well, and active funds can occasionally beat the market. There are people we all know them, the people that do this consistently, but they're very, very rare. Those people are like the Warren Buffetts of the world, and you know them. Anyone else who does that, unfortunately, most active funds underperform the market, and especially over a long time period. It's not that hard to do well 1 year or 2 years, but over a long time period, it's almost impossible. Just to highlight a couple, here's a quote from Nobel laureates Eugene Fama and Kenneth French, and their results say, our results on long-term performance say that true alpha and net returns is negative for most, if not all, active funds. Very, very hard to do well. That's on performance. And the last, the reason that index funds matter, and I think they do really well in the Thrift Savings Plan, is that this minimizes the kinds of political risk you might have from choosing active management. It is just trying to maintain the market, and you can say, why did you do well, or why did you do poorly? This is exactly what the stock market did. There wasn't any active choice or poor choice. This is this is what the market did, and so it's transparent, people can understand it. The last element of the thrift savings plan that I think is really key to highlight is these sensible defaults. You're already by law required to do most of these defaults. So I want to just quickly, I'll pass through this. This is showing, especially this is for young workers, new workers. They show how much more likely they are to save with automatic enrollment versus not. It's a dramatic difference. As you all know, this is sort of why you want people saving young, is because over a person's lifetime, the earlier you save, the much more likely you are to get to a sufficient account balance where you can have a secure retirement. These percentages are the probabilities based on some modeling that you're going to get to a target level of assets, which we think, and I can explain what that is more, but that's going to get you to a secure retirement. And you can see if you start saving young, you've got a pretty good chance. If you start saving older, it's really hard. So the automatic enrollment is key. There was a little question in the last thing about sort of what's the right default level. 3% is clearly too low, but I want to highlight that it is actually pretty good for a lot of low-income workers. If the target you're trying to get to is at least 70% of your, if you want someone to be able to replace about 70% of their previous income, that's sort of the low end of kind of what most people think you want to get to. Just here's some, this is for a minimum wage worker. And now the key is this includes Social Security. Social Security does most of the heavy lifting here, and especially for low-income workers because it's a progressive program. But you're getting them to close to where they need to be. So some relatively small nudges could probably get you a little further, and maybe even some help from the state, or could maybe get you where you need to go. The last, as I said, I wanted to tease this up, is the payout phase really matters. Did I go back? Yeah, payout phase. So what the thrift savings plan has is it has an option, so you can get a lump sum, you can structure, you can say I want to take a certain percentage every year, or you can get a lifetime payout, an annuity, a guaranteed payout. And the key thing to take away from this slide here is that getting someone a low-cost lifetime income stream makes them much more likely to have a secure retirement. The do-it-yourself model is inefficient, and it's fraught. You've basically helped someone accumulate all this money all their life, and then, well, you're on your own when you're getting to retire, and it's still a very complicated decision. How long are you going to live? What are the interest rates like at the time? And so the rule of thumb that people tend to operate by is, well, you'll take about 4% of the amount of assets you'd saved and try to just manage that on your own. As you can see here, that is makes you much less well off. So I think you can think about different options for sort of annuitizing some portion, or at least offering that as an option for some people. And the last slide, and I will quickly go over this because I know I'm running low, is to highlight these elements of the thrift savings plan that I've highlighted, especially the low cost. When you add them together and compare them to a typical 401k, or even what someone might have if they are likely to work for a small employer, which many of these people would have, where the cost would be even higher, how much better off you can make them. These are people doing exactly the same thing, saving the exact amount of money, earning the same amount. This is modeled basically on a median income worker, but the same point holds for even the lower income worker. Over 2 times as likely to get to a secure retirement, just compared to a typical 401 play, compared to what you could likely get to in a thrift savings plan-like plan. And that's a huge difference, that the individual, again, did the same thing. They did nothing wrong, but because the plan design was good or bad, they had a dramatically different outcome. And so with that, I want to just leave you that there's a very good model. It works well, worked well for years, that has lots of features that you can just take right up and steal and use. And I think people will be well served by that. Thank you.